Dear colleagues, dear partners, hello, buongiorno, bonjour, grüezi. We at the Data Science Competence Center of the Swiss Federal Statistical Office are very happy to welcome you to our Data Science and AI for Public Good webinar series. My name is Kirsten Johansson Baker, and I head the Competence Network for AI of the Swiss Federal Administration. As our Data Science and AI for Public Good webinar series is entering its second year, we are, of course, as convinced as ever of the importance of data science for improved public policy making and increased trust in the public sector. It is thus a great honor to welcome our special keynote speaker today, namely Dr. Paruolo from the European Commission Joint Research Center. His keynote presentation, entitled Data Access and Trust in the Public Sector, Learning What Works, will focus on what works and for whom in evidence-informed public policy making and how that translates to public trust, hopefully, because ultimately it is about creating value for public welfare, or as we call it here, data science for public good. Our moderator today will be my colleague, Christopher Sulkowski, a data methods engineer here at the Data Science Competence Center, formerly at the European Central Bank. But before handing over to Chris, I would like to remind the audience that if you wish to submit questions to the speaker, please use Mentimeter. You can find the link in the email invitation that you got or in the description section under this YouTube live streaming. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Kirsten. And hi, everyone. Paolo heads the Competence Center on Microeconomic Evaluation at the European Commission's Joint Research Center. He has taught econometrics at the University of Insubria and the University of Bologna. An econometrician by training, he holds a doctorate from the University of Copenhagen and is interested in theoretical and applied econometrics, as well as counterfactual methods. His publications rank him among the 150 econometricians in the world. Paolo, I'll give you the floor.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks for this nice setup. And I hope to entertain you for the next half hour or so, talking about data access and trust, learning what works. Apologies for taking the webinar series title wrong, because I think I missed AI there. But let me just spend a few seconds telling that, okay, my name is Paolo. I work for the European Commission, and the Commission is divided in the sectors or departments, and my department is called Joint Research Center. We are based in several sites. So my site is in Ispra, province of Varese, so it's very close to the Swiss border. Then I work for the Competence Center of Microeconomic Evaluation, which is one section of a unit that has as mandate to work on the modeling, monitoring, and evaluation. So it's the unit is very much about the policy cycle, and our section is more about impact evaluation. So just to remind people of where things are on the planet, this is where we are. We're like 30 kilometers from the Swiss border. Our colleagues at the GIC work either in Brussels, as you may expect, but also in several sites spread across Europe, like one is in Seville, several ones are in Germany, the Netherlands, etc. But a large chunk of colleagues sits with us in this site, which is close to the Lago Maggiore. And what is the GRC? It's supposed to be the Science for Policy Directorate in we call these departments Directorates General. So it's the department in the European Commission that tries to support policy through science. So it's the Science for Policy section or department. So this is the website, and this is what I would like to talk about. So I would like to first take a few seconds to describe the current environment, which I would describe as data rich but trust poor. Then I would like to focus on learning which is the main message that this talk would like to carry through. Then I'm going to speak about a little bit of the challenges and possible solutions that we face currently and what data has to do with it. Then I would propose something that would be possibly of interest for people that are tuned to this talk. And then I'll give you some reference just to find where these things can be found in writing. So let me start with the first thing, which is the trying to describe the environment. What are the challenges that we have a lot of AI, we have a lot of developments in terms of using data to try to deliver service, but also to generate value added for the private sector. But how about the public sector? Can we do anything with the amount of data that we have that will bring value to the citizens? Yeah, so that's the basic point. Next, I wanted to quote some, relevant people. And so what we're going to talk about is policy evaluation. So learning how the various policies that are put in place by the public sector are actually working. Do they actually deliver on the promises? Do they give unintended side consequences? What is it? And then this is a nice quote from Milton Friedman that said that one of the great mistakes is to judge policies by their intentions rather than their results, which brings us to one other quote, which is the last one that I'm going to give, I hope, which is Deming used to say that without data, we are just people with opinions. But and also he made this joke about, the dollar bill that brings this, in God we trust, but all others needs to bring data. That is, if we want to be convinced, we need facts. So this brings us to what I would like to speak about, which is learning what works and how this creates value for the citizens. In the end, if it is spending programs, it is just making the investment in the social policies work at best. So it's like a return on social investment. So this kind of thing came to the attention of non-economists lately, because also the Nobel Prize was given to this trio of people that actually was working on this idea to do policy evaluation as a means to learn. They called it the credibility revolution in economics. And the idea started mainly in labor economics, but then spread out to other applied fields of economics. So we're very happy that these people got the Nobel Prize, because this is what we're trying to implement. And what does this kind of technicalities need? Well, the technicalities are called counterfactual impact evaluation, and they sort of try to start from an ideal solution. The ideal solution would be that if you have a medical experiment, you try to see if some drug works, then you put people through an experiment. Some of them are treated by the drug. Some of the people are not treated, and they make up this comparison or control group. And then you sort of compare the average outcome of the treated and the control groups. And this gives you like the causal estimate of how the drug influences the outcome. So the idea is that these counterfactual methods, they work through application of these kind of techniques and similar ones. So they need a lot of data on the individuals that are treated or untreated. And the individuals could be, live beings, or they could be firms, they could be units that are that live in the economic environment, so to speak. So what this kind of methodology implies is that you have access to data, that you can link people that are treated and people that are not treated to their outcomes. And the outcomes could be, for instance, if you have training given to unemployed people, if they find a job after they finish their training. So the basic question that these methods try to address is what would have happened without the treatment. So without an unemployed person being treated through participation to the program. So that's what counterfactual means. And the idea is that in the real world, we have both space for experiments, but also for data that is generated by natural experiments, which is the working of the economy as it develops. then we could try to take stock with the data that's been generated by this gigantic experiment run by nature, and try to see if we can be smart enough to come up with methods that would replicate, that would kind of mimic the experimental situation where we can compare treated and controls. So this is what this revolution in economics, the credibility revolutions, sits upon. And then one could say, why do we actually need this? Or can we just leave it to the professional economists that work at the university? The idea is that this is actually intersecting a number of issues that have a central interest for the public sector in terms of evaluating how policies actually performed. So I'm just listing a number of things that are like keywords for the Commission at the moment. So when we speak about evaluating policy, we often talk about efficiency. So was the policy efficient in delivering its intended effects? The effectiveness, which maybe comes even before, that is, was it actually effective in delivering what the policy was supposed to deliver? But also, has this created value added with respect to the national policies that are already in place? So all this relies on the fact that you could possibly come up with some methods that tries to attribute the changes in the outcomes for the people to the policy in place. So just to take the example of the unemployed people being subject to a training, what we would like to see is that the people that got the training later found with higher probability a job, with respect to the control group that did not take the training. And then this is like attributing the effect, the extra probability to find the job, to the policy intervention. So in a nutshell, the idea to try to find these causal links for policies that are funded by the public sector, this is central for the good run of the public administration. So this is for the Commission, but this is also of interest for a number of groups, a number of countries in the world. And then I'm just quoting two. The UK has a network that is called What Works Centres Network. And this is basically the same idea to try to understand which policies work in various fields, policy fields, and they're sort of connected through this network. And then there's also an initiative which is very nice, and I would like to refer to it again by the US, which established like a commission. I think it was a White House commission under Obama, and they were researching how to make good use of data for policy, and they came up with a nice document that I may refer back to in a while. So the idea is that, for instance, in the UK network, there's a lot of use of these randomized control trials, which is the experimental situation where you have the ability to randomize people into treatment and to the control group. But this goes beyond, because also the US case, for instance, refers to the quasi-experimental methods, which are trying to recover similar situations of treated and control when the data is actually generated, but not by an experiment, but is observed by what people in economics call passive observation. So this is not only relevant for the Commission, but seems to be working, seems to be in the radar of public sectors worldwide. And what are the ingredients for this kind of learning? So in a sense, you would need data from the field, field being an experiment, if you can sort of use this randomization before implementing your policy. Of course, there are reservations about the randomization bit, because sometimes the policymakers may feel that the public will think that they do not know better than randomized treatment, because they think that some people deserve the treatment more than others. So that would be against fairness. So there are reservations out there if you want to implement randomization, but not always. But even if you cannot do randomization, there are these causal methods that try to make up for the lost randomization to attack this selection bias that you have when you compare treated and control if the assignment is not done randomly. So the idea is that, yes, what you need is data and methods. And this is, of course, there's a variety of methods that can be applied. They are more and more sophisticated if you want to take into account the fact that the data is not randomly generated by a random scheme. So this is the reference to the natural experiment and the Nobel Prize Overmont that actually introduced the idea. So going back to where this is actually relevant, let me speak a little bit more about how the Commission is interested in this. So the Commission started, as you know, the Commission is actually producing pieces of legislation that are either directly applicable, so they are regulations, or they are then translated into national law for the member states. But for sure, we have a number of policies that have been in place for a number of years, and we would like to see how we can improve them, lessen the burden of their implementation that is put on the firms and citizens, possibly also the public administrations. So this idea to try to improve is being captured by this agenda that came into being in the last 20 years. It's called Better Regulation Agenda. So there's a number of communications done by the Commission about its own internal workings on how to improve. So the early ones are from the early 2000s. The Better Regulation Agenda, with its name, has come into being in 2015. And the idea is to try to use best evidence in order both to prepare the design of the new piece of legislation, but also how to then monitor it and then evaluate it at the end, and use the evaluation to try to have a new redesign of the policy so as to make it more effective. So in this communication of 2015, there was a side piece of communication done the year after on data information knowledge management and in the European Commission. And part of this, the 4 points were these, but one of the action points was actually to create the competence center that I'm heading at the moment. So in 2016, this competence center in Microeconomic was created out of the wish to try to improve on the evaluation bit of the policy cycle in Europe. And here is a quote from a recent reincarnation of this Better Regulation Agenda, which was done in the year 2021. And the idea is that all pieces of legislation can be improved, and maybe they should be, because the world changes, so their effectiveness, efficiency, value added, etc. changes. So we need to keep up with the changing world, but also because we want to learn from experience, because nobody knows beforehand if what you sort of expect is going to materialize and why. So this 2021 communication was actually stating this principle that says that before you want to change anything, please take a look at the data, which is called evaluate first principle. So this all these documents are online, and you will find them easily. So there's more on this, on what the various evaluations need to be, but I'll just keep it for the sake of brevity. So I just want to put here a little bit of the intervention logic. So the idea of the Commission, but also I think of many policymakers, is to say there's a number of needs that we start from that we would like to address, some market failures, some lack of coordination between the member states, or suboptimal situations that we would like to correct. And then from the needs, we go to the objectives, and also to the design of the policy through the inputs, the activities that we want to put in place, and also what they are going to imply in terms of outputs. Now, the outputs, all these expected effects, are either classified as outputs if they're very close to the activities, then they become results and then impacts. But also, we know that the activities that are put in place to implement the policies will be determinants of what the real outcomes will be, because also other policies will come into play, and also external factors may influence what actually happens on the ground. So why did they create the Competence Center on Microeconomic Evaluation? Because they felt, and we are tasked to try to improve the level of understanding on how to address these questions, on how to do proper impact evaluation, how to evaluate effectiveness, efficiency, EU value added. And so the activities of these competence centers try to straddle at least 3 levels. One is to try to do some of the evaluation studies ourselves, either in collaboration with the member states or with the Commission at large. They have different remits. The member states need to evaluate, for instance, the spending programs that they actually finance within the member state from European sources. So they have this mission. Whereas the Commission has the mission to try to evaluate overall. So we try to help both, trying to team up and do studies with them. But we also try to give advice to other departments in the Commission that may not have the time or the willingness to engage with us directly. And we try also to work on the capacity building, meaning we try to improve the understanding of what a good evaluation should be. We have produced a number of easy video tutorials on what these things should be like. And if you happen to come across these slides later, you can click and see and go. Anyways, so what the Competence Center does is sort of summarized in yearbooks, so you will see that. But just to get a glimpse, so it's now a team of 20. This is not 20 people, it's more because we have some turnover of people. And what we do is we try to do either one of these 3 things, and we're sort of working usually in groups of 2, 3. And I want to give you a few examples. So we have worked on the evaluation of the Roam Like at Home, which is a policy that Switzerland does not have, which is when you go abroad, you do not pay roaming charges if you are within Europe. And this is very much known among citizens because this is something that they can see directly. But there was like a little bit of debate about whether this would put some of the operators out of business because they will lose the right to claim charges for roaming from abroad within the European Union. So we actually followed this and we used data from the markets and we try to evaluate both the effect on volumes and on prices. And the conclusion was that indeed the prices were not significantly changed by the introduction of this directive in 2017. And that on the other hand, the use of this exploded because of course people then roamed like they were home. And then this is another example, which is coming from another initiative that the Commission took a few years ago to try to diminish the delay between the time that some work is invoiced and is actually paid by the clients. And so this was reduced, I think, to 90 days. And this was an evaluation that we did to try to see if this actually brought about some improvement. So these 2 examples tell you that we try to evaluate policies that go beyond the spending programs. So that is, you either get financed or not. So which is sort of an easy game where the people that receive the funding or receive the treatment due to the funding are treated, and the ones that do not receive it are the control, which is sort of kind of easy. But the same kind of methodology can be applied also to market cases where in principle everybody is treated. And here the idea of seeing if there were changes across the date where the intervention took effect is actually at the basis of these diff and diff kind of models that are used in this area. Just to give you a feeling that this is not confined to a setting where you have easily identified treated and controls. So, okay, everybody lives happily. We have access to data. Everything works. We do a great job. So what's the talk about? The talk about is that this is not as easy as it looks if you have been exposed to this before. because there may be a lack of appropriate data, and also reliability of data is another issue. But even more so at Commission level, we are not very much, there's not a long tradition, say, for accessing microdata, because the Commission had a lot to do with macro in the past, and not so much access to microdata in the past. So this is an issue, of course. Then we have the GDPR, which I think Europe is proud of, but at the same time can be interpreted against the use of data that is already collected for other purposes, which was not the intention of the law. I'm pretty sure that all these provisions that try to say that data should be accessible in a safe way for research is actually trying to prevent this distortion of the use of the GDPR. But indeed, it is there. It could be a problem. And the third kind of challenge that this kind of area faces is the fact that some of the politicians, I would say maybe policymakers, not really the policy masters, but maybe the people working in the departments that have actually implemented policy, they may feel that if the evaluation does not show brilliant results, then maybe it's their fault, and then they think that this is not something that they look forward to. So this idea to try to have also, there's a challenge in the kind of atmosphere of how to receive the results from an evaluation. So that's also a challenge. So is there anything we can do about this? I don't know how much time I've consumed, but anyway, so we find at least 3 areas of hope. So one is that overall, for all challenges, we need a common language. That is to try to convey the message of what actually is working, for whom, and what are the limitations and the challenges. What I mean by this is, if we go back to the one slide and say lack of appropriate data, in principle, there's a lot of data in registries in the member states of Europe, and I'm sure also at the federal office in Switzerland, that could be tapped into with appropriate methods if one has a proper trust relationship between the public and the public sector, in order to try to grant access to these data for research purposes. So, and a common language is one of the means that we can use to try to make this trust relation improve. Another kind of proactive thing that one could do is to build a community of practice, by which we mean a community of people that are actually concerned with either the results or the use of data or the actual research that is being done on the data, that try to exchange points of view and approaches and results, and be open about possibilities to improve everybody's learning. So instead of coming together as on a negotiation table with taking 2 different sides of the table and saying, I give you something in exchange of something else, this community of practice comes together with the idea to try to improve learning overall, and with the idea that everybody would be better off by having a better understanding of what is actually working and what not. And of course, all of this would be made possible if we had better access to microdata. So also improving the access to microdata would be a driving factor for improvement. So what to do about common language? I sort of spoke about this before. And the basic thing is to try to avoid to think that the policy work, how effective a policy is actually judgment on the personal success or failure of some decision makers. This is not the case. I think we should try to say that decision makers will be judged if they're open about understanding how the policies worked. So this is again a trust relationship between, say, the policymakers and the public, and also the research community. We acknowledge that the policymakers and the scientists, they live in a different world with different time spans and environments. And the scientists need more time, and the policymakers do not have time. And so there's a struggle there. But if we can sort of talk to each other, maybe we can sort of overcome this. And what is the idea? Well, the idea, at least at the Commission, what we try to foster within the Commission is to try to say, let's co-design the process. Of course, you will be hard pressed for time at the very end of the policy cycle or in other phases. So let's try to see if we can actually plan things ahead of time and try to make this design shared among the different actors. So that's what we try to foster. That's what we try to do with the other departments of the Commission that most of them, they live in Brussels. They say, we try to say, let's try to work together throughout the policy cycle, because it's not at the end where you can ask questions like, oh, where's the data? Because that would be too late most of the time. This is, of course, in line with this revised better regulation, which actually calls to have the best available evidence. One incarnation of this idea to try to co-develop is this community of practice. And I already talked about this. Maybe a little bit more details on this is that you would like to have scientists in the room. You would like to have maybe policy officials, because they will be the users of the results. And then you can also have people that are actually coming from the data holding institutions. And the dialogue could be the way that we kind of learn the needs of different actors and of different phases. There's a lot that we can learn. For instance, what has worked in a country may or may not work in another country, but there's a lot we can learn, even though we know that the science calls the external validity of the studies is not guaranteed. So the idea to have this peer effect in learning what has worked, what has not worked in another member state or in another country is really something that we are not tapping to the most to the best possible way at present. So here's a picture from Latvia, where we were kind of doing this community practice for the European Social Fund. But what we're trying to say is that even beyond a specific policy field, we would like to foster this idea to bring more researchers in the room so that we can get something done with the data. Another example of where we try to get together with the scientific community is this COMPI conference. COMPI stands for Counterfactual Methods for Policy Impact Evaluation. We started this conference series even before the Competence Center was created, because some of us were already working here. So we had 2 editions in Italy, 2 in Germany. We had 1 online because of the COVID. And next we're moving to Amsterdam. But you're most welcome to participate. And if you have interest in this area, maybe if you want to see good presentations, we have some material online, and please come and get in contact about this. So what can we do to facilitate access to macrodata? I think learning how this is done in different member states is already a step. So for instance, we have tried to have pilot studies with different member states in Europe. We also had some collaboration with New Zealand. New Zealand is an advanced country in linking data from public registries, but for some reason we were not able to go a long way. Then we also fear that also the public in Europe could say that New Zealand is not a European country. So this was discontinued, but the idea to work on this is really worldwide. And we would like to do this already with nearby countries like Switzerland. That would be super fantastic if we could say all that we say about sharing data, sharing experiences, working on each other's data, commenting, making improvements. If we could do it also with people that work with Swiss data, that would be super. So here comes our solution, and I think I will be done in 3 minutes, so that questions can, start to flow in. So what we would like to propose is beyond, member state membership or us being placed at the Commission or whatever, we would like really to have a community of practice. COP maybe is not the right acronym, because it sounds like some police kind of thing, but the community of practice on counterfactuals, it could be really something that we could share with any country in Europe, any country worldwide that is willing to do rigorous science using microdata. And the idea is to create a community that is not necessarily linked to a specific policy area, not necessarily labor. It could be markets, it could be anything, that involves scientists that are the driving force to try to make good use of the data to understand these causal links between policy and their effects. The policymakers, possibly, and also citizens organization, whoever wants to contribute to this kind of exploitment of data that is already collected for good purposes. So all this requires a trust relationship between groups, but also this will increase trust, because if you see that the public sector is not holding on to the security of the data as the guiding principle, but tries to exploit it under safeguards as a creator of value added for the citizens, I think the public will be also more inclined to trust the public administration more. Of course, we would like this to be without boundaries, which means there's no boundary within Europe, but there shouldn't be any boundary between Europe and Switzerland or any other country. What would the different groups gain? So the citizens, they would know how a specific policy put in place in their country actually worked. So this is going to increase the accountability of the public sector. The policymakers, they would understand what works, and they would have food for thought on how to design better policies for the future. The data holding institutions, they would also have the plus to have the data being used not only to be kept safe, but also to create value added for the public. This would increase the amount of trust that the public may have on how the public administration is using its resources. And the scientists would come out with more publications, and they would be, of course, happy. So this is it. I just wanted to say, I give you a few links of where we can be contacted. So there's a function in both mailbox that you see there, a website, the Compi conference series. And this is it. I have a number of references. There's a book that we co-edited a few years ago that is trying to tell a little bit of the experience in several member states. And also we wanted to have a chapter on New Zealand, but it didn't work out. Then we also have a chapter in this other publication by the Polish Regional Development Agency that is sort of telling a little bit a few stories from the experience of the first 5 years in the competence centers. Then we have other references, and I want to really point out this publication of the US Evidence-Based Policy-Making Commission, which is actually saying one important piece of information, which is that keeping the data safe does not mean keeping it closed and not accessible. That you can have improvement in the accessibility of data and on its safety at the same time. And I think that it's nice to hear it from the US. Anyway, other references that you can find elsewhere, and then this is where you can find me. And thank you. Thank you. No, I shouldn't show this now, I guess. Maybe back to one of the slides, yeah? Over to you. Chris or Kirsten?
Thank you so much, Paolo, for this really interesting presentation. We will now move on to questions. If anyone in the audience wishes to ask any kind of questions regarding this presentation, you can do so through the link, through the Mentimeter link. Maybe to just get us started, I would have a question regarding the fact that trust requires understanding for why one should trust in the first place, especially given the recent public availability of models such as ChatGPT, as you mentioned, and the diffusion models, and their vast methodological differences with your own work. What should be done to move away from magical thinking about such methods and instead further increase understanding of statistical research and critical comprehension of their limitations?
Thanks for this question. I mean, this is a question on trust. So how do we make this process trustworthy? No, I was impressed that the young friends of my sons, they use ChatGPT to study. Okay, that's already news. Yeah, it's not something that comes as a fancy. It's already there. In a sense, we do not want to have the public registries being exposed to ChatGPT. Fine, but we would like to create a safe environment where people that are trustworthy and then they're sort of trusted researchers can look at the data in a safe environment. They cannot take away results that could impinge the confidentiality of the data, but at the same time can have an informed discussion about what the data tells. Because one thing is to say that data is there and then we want to take a look at it in a way that is checkable by other groups. It's not, your own research and nobody can see. But at the same time, we don't want to put it in the public domain because that could be kind of distorted. And I know that you must have more experience than me in trying to make ChatGPT lie, which is easy to do. And so misinformation can be, the result of training these AI machines to do what they're not intended. Yeah. So in a sense, the fact that we would like to have a safe environment where we can actually exchange ideas and be open, not on the release of data to the, private sector, but to try to understand what actually is working in terms of public policies. I think this is going to bring a lot of value added and trust.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe another question on a very, very related topic is that trust also requires replicability and availability of the data used for the research. This is especially important in the case of public policy, given that citizens surely would appreciate the opportunity to judge results and methods for themselves or via alternative mechanisms. How would you square such concerns with those made explicit by GDPR regulations, such as privacy, but also the political sensitivity of some of the work that you carried out?
Thanks for the question. I think I would use the example of the vaccines that were tested in recent times for COVID. So that was a case where we wanted really to have evidence on whether these vaccines worked and for whom and under what conditions. And there was randomization being done, but it was not a field, it was not a laboratory experiment. It was a field experiment because the real people were actually injected, no? So that's to say that the public good requires also to take steps that in a sense require to have scientific evidence. Yeah, this is not this should not come at the detriment of the privacy of data and the privacy of confidential information, but there are plenty of experiences that tell us that this is actually doable. I just also want to quote all the Scandinavian countries that have a wonderful system where whoever is sitting at a university place can actually access the data that is actually linked at the public administration. And whatever research comes out is actually used and debated in the policy arena, so to speak. And so the idea to have access to data is not to have a vantage position. It should come as from a mandate from the public to learn more about what is actually working, because we are spending money, we're regulating markets, and we don't know what these regulations and funding imply. And so there must be a public value added in having evidence about these. And somehow this is just as learning how effective the vaccines were for COVID, no? And there are ways we can do it, and we have done it in the past, and this is the experience of COVID vaccines, it's the experience of the Scandinavian countries, it's the experience of many countries worldwide. So why shouldn't we do it also in our country, and how could we exploit more what is not being tapped in terms of potential?
Yeah, this very much falls actually in, again, the next question that I wanted to ask you. For your community of practices, community of practice you mentioned is important for development of capacity building among stakeholders, and active critical assessment of research. Given that such work is inherently made difficult by the complexity of human behavior, among many other features, obviously, could you maybe touch on how such community can, or even already has, improved concrete projects or studies conducted in this field?
So we have, of course, we're not the first to experience this kind of community of practice approach. There is experience that this is actually bringing value added. And the fact that, for instance, in the context of the Commission, when I showed you the Rome Like at Home evaluation, that was done thanks to the fact that we could work with the national regulatory authorities that were overlooking the markets. Otherwise, this would have been impossible. And the fact that we actually came up with something that was then later used by them and was sort of co-developed is the key to success. So either this is done through co-development or community, or it doesn't happen. So I think that this idea of community is central because there are so many diverse actors. I just identified these three groups, like the researchers, the policymakers, and the data holding institutions, which are large groups. But of course, they need to be in the room and they need to share the common thirst to learn, in a sense. Not because you want to judge anything, but because we want to make life easier or better for the citizens. So, I mean, so it's not a rosy picture. I mean, we face all possible challenges in this, but that's the way forward. I mean, the world is complex. We shouldn't leave it to machine to make, a simplification of complexity. We should have the human factor, and the human factor is this community approach.
No, really interesting. We have a question from the audience. And are these methodologies applied, and how systematically in all new EU regulations? And if not, on which factors or conditions is it depending on?
Thanks for the question. So we are, of course, strong advocates of these methods, and we actually participate to the internal meetings that we have within the Commission between different departments with this body that oversees the quality of impact assessments, which is the ex-ante phase, and the evaluations, which is called Regulatory Scrutiny Board. We participate to all of these meetings, and we try to propose every time. There are ways to go about this with counterfactual methods. And I think that the common understanding is that whenever possible, this should be applied, because this is the more convincing way that you can show that real effects actually happen on the ground. Sometimes what we see is that some of the evaluations that go through this kind of internal review process refer to interventions that are maybe 20 years old, and maybe 20 years ago nobody thought about putting the provisions in the law to try to collect data in due time to have a proper evaluation with counterfactual methods, which is understandable because maybe it was not so clear back then that this should be the case. So what we try to advise in that case is to say, here's an occasion because we're doing the evaluation and we have no data or no data access because maybe the data exists, but it's not accessible. Maybe it's the good time to rethink about what provisions we should put in the law so as to be able to do a proper evaluation forward. But to the interested viewer, I would say, please go and look at our leaflet of what we call yearbooks. And there's a list of publications of what we've been doing, how we've been managing to do this on a European scale or on a regional scale in the past. So this is witness that this is possible. It's not done always, and there are reasons, some of them understandable, some of them not so much, that you sort of would agree with, but I mean, we can improve, of course. But if you want to see what is the state of play, come and look at our publications.
Great. And remind everyone, all the viewers, that you still can submit questions. And I would be interested in a few methodological questions, if you don't mind. The first one of which being that you stated in your presentation that results may differ between countries. And effectively, while your results for a given policy can be evidence for its causal effects, such results could also very well be attributed to country-specific considerations and may not transfer as well to other contexts. How do you understand such concerns, and what do you do in general to account for such considerations?
So first of all, this is interesting, but I would put it this way, that Europe has many countries with different institutions. They also share some institutions. The Commission is one. So, I mean, we have similarities and we have differences. So we have sources of homogeneity, but also heterogeneity. This brings us to the fact that this is like a living laboratory where nature, in this case, maybe economic, but also environmental nature, is actually churning out data through a natural experiment. An example is, for instance, we had the pandemic. All the countries in Europe had the pandemic, and they had to do something to try to keep their firms alive. So there were some, say, short-term work provisions done by different member states or countries in Europe. And you see that I always say member states, I should say European countries, but forget. Then you would like to see why some of them worked better than others. What were the driving factors? Was it because some of them were characterized by employment protection laws that were stricter or more lax? So we could try to come about, understanding the driving factors of this heterogeneity, and this could bring us also a little bit of understanding on how different institutions play, what role they play in getting the results. So this idea is that we could exploit it for understanding. We have a laboratory that has some sources of heterogeneity, and we could use them to learn, why these effects differ. But there's a lot that we could learn, because most countries are going to implement some policies that were implemented in some other state. And why shouldn't they learn what impacts the other countries faced, in a sense? So I think there's a lot to learn. Then there's no guarantee that what has worked in one will work in another, but maybe we could use also this situation to learn why.
And still on the same topic, another question I think I would have regarding theoretical concerns would be related to the emergent complexity of behaviors when going from the local to the population level. Taking the naive example of universal basic income being implemented in the town to understand its effects, what are your thoughts on taking local conclusions to the population level?
So there's a theoretical literature on what we call usually the equilibrium effects. That is, when you go from a local level to a macro level, there may be what we call equilibrium effects that come into play. So I think there's a need to study the macro relationship that in econometrics has been really the focus of some research in the 60s and the 70s, which I like very much, but I haven't seen very much ever since, which means that there's not that we need to learn on how to reconcile the macro models, the micro models, and the behavior at different scales, which means that there's a lot that the researchers may want to tackle. And there's a lot of field. I'm an econometrician. I think there's a lot that needs to be developed in terms of methodology also to try to learn these connections. But the fact that we have the microdata is, I think, putting us in a better position, because we could also calculate the aggregates and see how the different, say, levels work on the data. Whereas if you just have the macro, then you can sort of speculate about the micro. Sometimes people do simulations instead, but who knows about whether the simulation model is actually correct. So in a sense, there's a lot of research need here, and I would be happy to look at it or contribute if I can.
We have a viewer question. How would you assess the two forces putting pressure on regulations, lobbying versus science evidence? Any chance evidence-based policymaking will prevail?
My hope is that the public will drive this debate in the right direction. That is, the lobbying sector has a lot of resources, but maybe its objective is more focused on sectors of society. So if we make the whole of society more aware about where the pluses and minuses are and how we can learn about them, maybe we could have also a better debate with groups, interest groups, kind of associations. And I think that the approach should be, has always been, that the public should not make any difference when talking to, I don't know, a business association or an NGO or somebody else. And in order to stand the questions from all sides, the public sector should have the best evidence possible. That's why we need it, because we need to confront the business sectors or the other interest groups that maybe focus on a section of society. But unless we have all the granular data, then it's very hard to say. Say that you have some NGO that says, oh, but this basic income given to all of the population is nonsense, or vice versa, whatever. Then you should have some argument to say, well, data says that, yeah. And if you want to scrutinize, you just send your scientist along, and then we can sort of try to see if our scientists are saying right or wrong. It should be that this is not checkable, that the public sector does not allow, say, peer effect or peer review.
Yeah, another viewer question. Are there any attempts to use data also to simulate regulation effects in some virtual model?
Yes, there's one famous example called Euromod. So Euromod is a way to try to mimic what different fiscal rules would imply in terms of income distribution in a given state. It's run on European countries. I'm not sure about non-European countries, but so this is done. And in principle, some of these things could be linked to say, transformations of data that is already existing in registries. For the time being, they're sort of based on EU Silk.
3 o'clock p.m.
Sorry, this is my clock. Did you hear it? No. No, it's 3 o'clock, it says. I don't know what this implies.
I believe we have a little bit more time for a few more questions. So please go for it.
No, but I was just saying that, yeah, I was done.
I think it's also perfect time as well for another question that I'm particularly interested in. Touching on the economics, the concept of rational expectation entails that individuals make predictions about the future and therefore behave based on all available information. This is important in the context of the subject, given that policies may have different dynamics based on whether the public already experienced them or even expects them to occur further into the future. This is obviously not an easy issue to accommodate, but I'm very interested to hear maybe if you have any comments regarding this issue.
There's a lot of literature both on rational expectations, which is more linked to macro models, and on behavioral economics type of studies, where I think the say in many individuals kind of behavior is taken into account, whereas in the rational expectation usually we have one representative agent. I think these models are nice, and of course we have the micro macro relations in the background, and then you can say we would like to learn more about why a certain policy actually had a certain impact. So I think that there's a lot that one can dig further after doing this kind of actual impact evaluation, which is about reduced form models, because you can go from the reduced form to the structural forms, or I mean some more say detailed models about how the effect came into being and what channels were activated. So this would also help understand which actually channels, which mediation factors were actually involved in in bringing the impact that you actually observe. So, measuring impact is just the first step, and one could go further. And there are many ways to do this. Rational expectations is one. I don't see a lot of rational expectation models being done on multi-agents. So I would say maybe there's bridges to be made also in the literature, the theoretical literature. But yeah, so there's a lot of work there as well.
Thank you so much. I have one last question for you, and are there any recent methodological developments in this field that you are really especially excited about? And would you be willing to maybe share some examples if you have some?
That's very nice. This is the question that we put to the people that come to our seminar series. So I'm glad that you put it to me. Then I should think a little bit out of my head. I'm sort of enthusiastic about what we could do with linking data from different sources. So this is something that I did not touch upon. So in a sense, we assume that all the data is available at the federal office, Swiss, whatever. Which is not the case. Sometimes some data, say who was treated, comes from the implementation agency, yeah, and the data on the outcomes, whether people found a job, comes from a national registry. So you have this challenge of putting things together. And the idea is that there are several ways to try to do it smart, so that you cannot impinge or impair the confidentiality of each of the registries by merging the data and then anonymize it. I think this is extremely interesting. And this idea to try to link different data sources is the future. And how to keep everything safe and easy for the user, which in this case is the researcher, is what really, sort of interests me the most. And also, I'm really looking forward to a time where the policymakers will not feel challenged if the results about the effectiveness of the policies are brought about, and they're sort of open about the fact that they did their best, and it's not their reputation that is at stake. So these things are really, a hope in my mind. And so from the theoretical point of view, I'm a theorist in econometrics, so I can tell you about that, but maybe it's not so fun for this audience. And these two things are really driving my interest in this field, that how we could possibly link data from different sources and use them for the policy making.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I just wanted to thank you infinitely for this presentation. And I found it really interesting, and I'm sure that the viewers did as well. I pass it on now to Kirsten.
Thank you very much, Paolo. And I think your final words will resonate with some people in Switzerland, as there is a lot of talk about secondary use of data and how this can be fixed from a legal framework point of view. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your nice keynote presentation. And have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.